Today we're making a quilt using a jelly roll, and the beauty of this is that you'll only need 20 strips. Now this is something that you can easily make in a day, and it'd make a lovely baby or lap quilt. Now a standard jelly roll like these two here usually come with 40 strips, so you can either make 2 of these quilts or set the other 20 strips aside for another project. Now you could even use strips from your scrap stash or start with a 20 strip jelly roll like I've done here. Now I think you're going to love how quick and easy this one is, so let's get started. Now the first thing I'm going to do is cut these down to size, so I'll just take the first strip and I'm going to line up the fold of the fabric on the 0 line on my mat. And then I'll take my ruler and I'll line that up on the 21-inch mark. At this point I am just going to make sure that the selvages are all outside of the cutting line, and they are, so I'm ready to cut. Now if you feel confident enough, you can speed this process up by taking 2 or more strips and stacking them one on top of the other. Either way, you will just want to go ahead and repeat that with all of the remaining strips. Now that my strips are all cut, I'm just going to open them out and lay them on my ironing board so that I can just press them to remove the fold line. Now you just need to lay out the strips in a pattern that pleases you. Now because I'm using a 20 strip jelly roll, it did have double ups in here, so there were 2 of each pattern, which made it a little more difficult to arrange, but we got there in the end. Now before we go any further, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, National Quilters Circle. Now it's a space made just for quilters where you can learn at your own pace, pick up new ideas and get guidance from experienced teachers who explain things in a clear and practical way. Now this was my most recent watch because even after all these years of quilting, I'm definitely no expert when it comes to choosing batting. Now what I really like is how Colleen explains why you might choose one batting over another, taking into account the finished look, the intended use of the quilt and how it will wash and wear. And this is just one example from their huge library of helpful videos. So whether it's squaring up fabric, getting an accurate 1/4-inch seam, using your rulers properly, or even something as simple as using a seam ripper, these videos walk you through everything step by step. And don't forget their growing collection of quilt patterns that you can download with designs suitable for a range of skill levels and styles. So if this sounds like something you'd enjoy and benefit from, then the first 1,000 people watching this video to use the link in my description will get a full year of premium membership to National Quilters Circle for only $1.49. And now let's get back to the tutorial. Now we're ready to start sewing the strips together, and I'm going to show you how I sew my strips to help prevent any bowing, which can sometimes happen if you sew all your strips in the same direction. That said, if you already have a method you love, feel free to go ahead and use that instead. So what I do first is sew the strips together in pairs, and I will sew all of them in the same direction. And I also gone ahead and pressed the seams for each of these all in the same direction. Now you absolutely can wait and do all your pressing at the end once every strip is sewn together, but I personally find it much easier to press as I go. It helps to keep everything neat and flat, and I think it gives the strips a crisper, more accurate finish overall. Next I'm going to sew these strip sets together into lots of 4, and this time I will be sewing in the other direction. So I've gone ahead and done that, as you can see here, and I'll show you how I press the seams, and you can see again that they're all running in the same direction. Now I'm just going to go ahead and sew the remaining pieces together to form the quilt top. And just to reiterate, this is the direction I sewed those seams, but don't get too hung up on trying to do what I did. Just try to alternate as much as possible to help prevent that bowing that can occur. So as you can see, the strips are all sewn together, and now I'm going to trim one side of this quilt top so that it's nice and even. To do that, I'm going to fold it in half and then line up the seam lines to ensure everything is straight. Now just take your time with this bit, as it will ensure you get a straight edge. Now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to place it pretty close to the edge because I don't want to cut off too much. The goal is just to get it straight. Before I cut, I just make sure that one of the lines of the ruler lines up with the fold line, and then I can cut. And I'm going to repeat that with the other side. So I'm going to rotate my mat just to get it at the right angle for cutting, and go ahead and line up my ruler again and cut. Now that I have a straight edge on both sides, I'm just going to move my fabric down a bit because I'm going to cut a strip from this quilt top. So I'll take my ruler again and line it up at the 8.5 inch mark. Now you could cut this a little smaller or a little wider if you wish. I'm going to use the 8.5 inch mark because that is the width of my ruler. And now that's cut, I'll set it aside for now as I want to cut another strip, and this time I'm going to line my ruler up at the 4.5 inch mark. And once I have it lined up nicely, I'm going to go ahead and cut. So at this point you should have one piece measuring 8.5 inches wide and one measuring 4.5 inches wide. Now I'm going to head over to the design floor and open these pieces up and lay them out. Then I'm going to take the smaller piece and turn it around like so. And at this point you could stop here and just sew it all together, and I think it would work really well for a lot of fabrics. But when we got to this point we felt that the fabric was just a bit too fussy for this design. So what I did was measure the quilt, and mine measured 42 inches. And if yours doesn't measure 42 inches, that's okay, because it should actually measure 40.5 inches. We couldn't figure out why ours was 42 until we measured the jelly roll strips and found that instead of measuring 2.5 like the label says, they actually measure 2 5/8. Fortunately, it doesn't affect the quilt in any way, so it ended up working out. But it's always worth checking the size of any pre-cuts you have before starting a project. They aren't always perfect. So, back to measuring the quilt, and the reason why I measured it is to get the size of some strips that I'm going to cut. So I've got some white fabric, and I'm going to cut a couple of strips that measure 1.5 inches by the width of fabric. And then I'm going to cut each of them so they measure 42 inches each, and you'll cut yours to the size that you measured. So I just lined up the fold of the fabric at the 0 line on my mat and cut at the 21 inch mark, and that will give me a 42 inch strip. And now what I'm going to do with these strips is sew one of the strips to each side of the middle strip set. Now I like to pin, and I suggest you do the same for this bit. I will pin at one end and then move down and pin at the other end. Then I'll give it a little tug and I'll pin in the middle, and then I'll go ahead and pin the rest of it. And I'll repeat that on the other side. Now that it's pinned, I'll go ahead and sew 1/4 inch on both sides. Okay, I have that sewn now, and I'll just flip this over so you can see that I've pressed the seams towards the coloured fabrics. If you press it towards the white fabric, you're more likely to see the seam underneath it. Now I'm going to sew this piece onto this one, and the beauty of adding these white strips is that you won't have to worry so much about lining up the seams. But even so, you want to take a little care to see that they are not too far out of alignment. So when it comes to sewing this piece onto here, I like to pin at each seam. And then before I sew, I open up the quilt to see if everything is lined up. Now this looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and sew it on. And you can see that I've sewn that piece on, and we're ready to add the final piece. But make sure you keep watching, as there is one more final step before the quilt is complete. But I will get this sewn on first. So my quilt top is just about there. But I'm going to measure it both vertically and horizontally, and mine measures 42.5 wide by 42 inches. Since I wanted mine to be a perfect square, I decided to trim off 1/2 inch, so I lined up my fabric again on my mat and I cut off the extra fabric from the wider side. And now my quilt top is finished, and I'm so glad I added the white strips. I think it just makes the quilt pop. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this tutorial, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more tutorials like this.